This is a guest essay written by Nahum Kaplan of Moral Clarity.
It might sound extreme, but the case for quitting is growing. The world has always hated Jews, and now that the Jews have their country back, the world's representative body is attacking it relentlessly. Remaining in the United Nations is like hanging out behind the school shelter shed with all the bullies who are never going to graduate. Israel should accept no more bullying from the UN. It should ban UN staff and operations in its territory immediately and consider quitting the corrupt anti-Semitic body for good. The latest outrage, yet another blood libel, is the UN's inclusion of Israel on a list of states it alleges to be the worst violators of children's human rights in armed conflicts. The UN based this on demonstrably inflated and deceitful statistics, the use of which characterizes the UN's approach to the Jewish state. The UN is so morally lost that it does not condemn the abduction of Israeli civilians as hostages, but gets outraged by the rescuing of them. The UN is so anti-Israel and anti-Semitic that it is almost satirical. The United Nations Relief and Works Agencies, also known as UNRWA, headquarters in Gaza, was built atop of and connected to a Hamas intelligence and communications hub. At least 12 UNRWA staff were directly involved in the October 7th pogrom, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And about 10% of UNRWA staff have known ties to Hamas, with many employees glorifying the October 7th pogrom. Spoiler: UNRWA is a terrorist organization. What's more, UN women had to be shamed into condemning Hamas's systematic raping, torture, and murder of Israeli women and girls. And the UN has continually passed resolutions that failed to condemn Hamas and pressured Israel for a ceasefire that would keep the terrorist group in power in Gaza. The UN Human Rights Council, one of the world's most disreputable bodies, has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than against Iran, Syria, North Korea, China, Cuba, and Venezuela combined. The Council's members comprise the world's worst rights abusers, such as China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Cuba. Israel is the only country that the UN Human Rights Council has a standing agenda item against in each session. Item 7, titled Human Rights Situation in Palestine and Other Occupied Arab Territories, is also the only item that singles out a specific country, guaranteeing Israel gets condemned in every session. The UN stinks from the head. Under Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the UN, quote, has become an anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli body that shelters and emboldens terror, Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said. Guterres, a moral pauper, said, quote, it is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. This is a lie. There have been no Israelis in Gaza since 2005. His suggestion that there is some way a pogrom could be justified shows his moral retardation. Israel's foreign ministry also said that Guterres has shown little resolve to tackle rampant anti-Semitism within the UN. This is clear. Guterres is not alone. The UN has a clone army of anti-Semites. Consider the vile Francesca Albanese, who has the energy of someone possessed by a dybbuk. She is the UN's special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, a title that is as biased and anti-Israel as her, since it presumes that disputed land is occupied. Her worldview, if one could call it that, is mired in deranged anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and tropes. She has written that, quote, America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby and regularly portrays Israelis as Nazis. In 2022, she told a Hamas conference that, quote, you have a right to resist, and she has denied that the fact that Hamas's October 7th attack was the worst attack on Jews since the Second World War. France and Germany rightly called out her undisguised Jew hatred. They should also have asked why a UN representative was addressing a jihadist conference. Then there is the stink of corruption. UN Watch, a Geneva-based watchdog, recently lodged a legal complaint with the UN, alleging that Albanese had engaged in serious financial misconduct and ethical abuses. The complaint alleges that Albanese illegally requested payments for work done in her official capacity and had payment for them directed to her research assistant, Sarah Troyan, to circumvent regulations. Francesca Albanese's unethical financial practices are a gross violation of UN rules. The United Nations should take immediate action to investigate these allegations and hold her accountable, said Hillel Neuer, executive director of UN Watch. He also called on the UN to disclose all Albanese's expenses and honoraria. The complaint also alleges Albanese co-founded and runs the Global Network on the Question of Palestine, an anti-Israel influence network that includes officials from the murderous Palestinian Liberation Organization and UNRWA. She runs it under the auspices of the laughably named Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development in Amman, an organization she joined in November 2018 as a senior advisor. This is appalling, but not surprising. The UN has form. In 1975, it voted that Zionism was racist. In other words, it supported the extraordinary notion that Jews living in their ancestral home was tantamount to racism. It twice elected Nazi Kurt Waldheim as its leader. UN peacekeeping efforts in the Middle East reflect the UN's incompetence and its disinterest in keeping Israel, the world's only Jewish state and the Middle East's only democracy, safe. In the last week alone, Iran-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon has fired thousands of missiles at Israel's north under the direct watch of UN peacekeepers who are stationed there doing nothing. UN peacekeepers have failed Israel every time they have been deployed since the Second Arab-Israeli War in 1956. Israel exists for Jews to govern themselves and be safe from exactly the kind of persecution in which the UN is engaging. How does it make sense for Israel to cooperate with or legitimize a body that is corrupt, biased, racist, and actively engaging in terror against the Jewish state? That is madness. Anti-Semitism surges when Jews are prominent and perceived as weak. Jews will always be prominent, but never again weak. The time might be coming for Israel to demonstrate that to the UN. Israel should begin by declaring UNRWA a terror organization, because it is one. It should shutter its operations in Israel and cease all cooperation with it. Israel should slow or reject UN staff visa renewals and boycott UN officials. UN missions, including UNICEF, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, should be put on notice for imminent termination and expulsion. The UN does not need to be in Israel to make things up about it. Israel should tell the UN to find its own way into Gaza. That should be easy given the UN's extensive connections to Hamas and the knowledge it claims to have of what is going on there. It is time for Israel to put some pressure back on the UN and show them that anti-Semitism carries a steep price. The UN and so-called international community will squeal that these agencies provide essential services to Palestinians. But after the October 7th pogrom, booby-trapped terror tunnels, lying to the world, and indoctrinating Palestinian children in jihadist Jew hatred, I would say Israel has had quite enough of the UN's essential services. Israel should also demand the UN explain what Israel gets out of being a member. The organization does nothing of value, so it is far from obvious. Why should Israel subject itself to the moral judgments of a quote-unquote UN Security Council that has thuggish, kleptocratic, warmongering Russia and authoritarian China as permanent members, and which rabid anti-Semites run? Israel will spend about $11 million on the UN this year, although it has cut this by $2 million in response to the UN's anti-Israel bias. Israel should not spend a shekel on membership of a loathsome organization that funds terrorism against it. That money would be better spent on a Tel Aviv beach party to celebrate Israel leaving the UN. The UN's failure to solve any of the era's many growing conflicts shows it has passed its use-by date. The stench of decay is unmistakable. Israel might as well get first mover advantage. Some might fear that Israel quitting the UN would make it look like the villain, recalling the fascists' states of Japan, Germany, Italy, and Spain pulling out of the League of Nations, helping to bring about its collapse. Beyond the League of Nations and the UN being equally ineffective, however, the situations have nothing in common. Besides, nobody cares about history anymore, as widespread belief in the entirely fictitious Palestinian narrative shows. Most of all, who cares what the UN thinks? I certainly do not. No one else should either.